Welcome to the Steady Anchor Podcast, a podcast on Christian faith and practice, highlighting doctrine and discipleship in the local church. I'm Luke, and welcome to the show. Welcome back to the Steady Anchor Podcast. I am Luke, your host, and today we are joined by a special guest. I'm doing a Zoom call here, so if you hear a little crinkle in the audio or something crazy happens, it's not my fault. So today, as we've talked about before in the show, the point of the show is not just to hear me speak or me and my friends speak. It's really to bring on more competent voices, the voices of other perspectives, of older and wiser people. And so today I wanted to have a conversation with my pastor, Pastor Charlie Barclay from 1-7 Church, who is joining us from his own quarantine back in Bourbonnais. So Pastor Charlie, thank you for coming on.
Hey, Luke, thanks so much for having me, man. Super excited to be here. I don't know, when I listen to your intro there, I do have the older part nailed down. That's the only part I'll claim, is that I definitely have the older part nailed down.
Well, you're definitely one of the wisest people I know. I mean, with the beard that you have, it's hard to see anything but like a modern rabbi.
Or wizard.
Or wizard, a little bit, yeah. Depending on how you comb it today.
Yeah, exactly. Or if.
Yeah. If for anyone who doesn't know Pastor Charlie, he has this great cropped kind of squared beard that's just the perfect outline of his face. Anyway, so we wanted to talk today about a little bit about you and your ministry. We wanted to talk about your testimony, your background, your perspectives on ministry. A main focus of this show is I want to get the voices of people explaining and recounting what God has done in their life, the walk of Christ that they've had, the trail of sometimes the hard-fought discipleship and sanctification, but all in the scope of God's goodness, recognizing that He is leading us, He is walking with us, even in the midst of crazy times like this coronavirus. And so if you could, just give us a bit about your background. Say as much or as little as you want.
All right. Yeah. So just growing up, I'll start there. Growing up, didn't grow up in church at all. Grew up to a pretty, I would say, nominal would be graceful, right? I would say that we grew up to really in a non-practicing Catholic home. I was my dad's only son. My mom had two boys and a girl from a previous marriage. So I had a couple half brothers and a sister, and all of us were. We went to church maybe on Easter, Christmas, that type of thing, and that was kind of the environment I grew up in for the longest time. I remember Mom buying me a story Bible when I was a really young kid and reading through that a little bit, but there really wasn't much talk about God in our home at all, or a need for Christ or anything like that. Really, the weirdest thing, Luke. I remember one point. I don't even know how old I was. I would say somewhere probably in the 7 or 8 year old range. I remember, this is the only memory I have of this type of thing. Like I was in a CCD class or something, and we talked about Noah, and I was coloring this picture of the ark. And I don't remember much of anything else, but I remember that moment for whatever reason. Anyway, you go. So grew up moved from the little small town we grew up in into Bourbonnais, where I am now, and started going to high school there. It wasn't until after high school that I started going to church. I started dating a girl who lived with whose grandparents took her to church every time the doors were open. And it was a little while before I realized, hey, if I wanted to see her more, maybe I could just spend time at church. So I started going to church.
That's how they get you.
That's right. Yeah. For those listening, I don't recommend necessarily dating evangelism, but this is how it started for me. And so I started going to church all the time. And one year for Christmas, my mom said, hey, if you're going to be going to church all the time, might as well have a Bible to take with you. So she bought me a Bible, and I started reading through it. I had gone away. After I graduated, I went to a very small architectural drafting school in northwestern Illinois, up by the Iowa border, called Morrison Institute of Technology. I wanted to be an architect at the time, and went up there for a semester. Just didn't fit, and so came back here and was gonna hammer out my general education requirements at Kankakee Community College. That's when I started going to church full time, I'll say.
Mm.
And when Mom bought me the Bible, started reading through the Bible.
You didn't want to take your Jesus picture Bible to church with you?
That was all that. Yeah, I could have.
Still
Is
got
that
the
or like a big?
still got the crayon colors and stuff in
That's
it.
right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. Like the bookmarks that I colored, the stained glass bookmarks hanging out.
Yes.
Yeah, right. The only option was either that or like a huge King James Family Bible with a picture of Jesus on the
Thump
cover,
that
real
down in
ornate.
the pew.
No, it's really exactly right. I carried on a cart. But so I remember just reading through the Gospel of John
Mhm.
and trying to learn about the life of Jesus, and read through it over and over and over again. And one day, sitting out in the parking lot, or sitting actually in the kind of the sitting area in between classes, reading through John, I just became convicted of my need for a Savior, and became really keenly aware of my sin. And I went out to the parking lot, and I opened up my car door, and knelt down on the parking lot and put my face in the seat of my car. And I just said, Jesus, I have really no idea who you are, but I know that you died to forgive me of my sins. And if you'll take away my sins, I'll give you my life and do whatever you asked me to do. It was very
Mhm.
simple. And it was a desperate prayer, really,
Yeah.
and he heard me. And I don't know how to explain it other than when I got up, things were different, man. I
Mm.
felt like I saw color for the first, like things were
Yeah.
bright. And it wasn't a road to Damascus kind of bright light. It was just something inside I knew had changed. Yeah. So
Mm. You
never been
woke
the
up in
same.
Oz. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
That's right. Huh. So that was my journey to faith, right? It was I'd say a short season of really intensely investigating the claims of Christ, and became quickly convinced by the grace of God that Jesus was exactly who he said he was.
Mhm.
And I found myself um, cornered, so to speak, and found no other option but to surrender. And so I thought it was third week of September 1990. Been a
Wow.
long time. Yep.
That's
Yep.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us then, how did you come from being that college student, being that kind of maybe unsettled or unhappy architectural design student,
Mhm.
coming to faith in Christ? How did you come from that third week of September to the point of ministry? What led you into working in the church? What led you to leadership? What led you to your church now?
Yeah. Whoa, boy, grab a snack. This could be a while,
Spin me a
So
yarn.
that's awesome. So yeah, it was an immediate desire in me to serve the local church. And so I just got involved, like, who needs help? And no idea, no spiritual gift assessment, nothing, of course, just like,
Jump right
there
in.
was no printout that told yeah, right. And so I just said, hey, who needs help and what can I do? And so my first assignment was the church I was attending at the time had a bus ministry. They went and picked up students on Sunday mornings for Sunday school, and so I became the bus captain. It was my job, so to speak, to ride along on the bus and make sure that the kids stayed in line and that they didn't set the bus on fire. Essentially, that was my first ministry position. I did that for sometimes, um, and beyond that, um, just really began to love the kids that I interacted with on the bus, and so got involved in helping kids church, and any way that I could help set up the space for kids church, and just did that. And then over time, the person that was leading kids church was going to leave. And so I ended up stepping up and leading kids church. I ended up leading that in some capacity for about 8 years. And so
Wow.
I did that. Had my first opportunity to teach was in kids church. Yeah. And I do have to say that when I came to faith, there was the pastor there was a man by the name of Tommy Guest, and Tommy was man, he was humble. He was phenomenal at letting young preachers have opportunity to preach and to help unpack our preaching and help prepare us. And so there was a Wednesday night, we had Wednesday night prayer meetings still, and there would be a teaching element involved in that. And so this is funny. He said to me, he said, "Hey, do you want to speak at one of those nights?" I said, "I'd love to, Tommy." And so he told me a story of his first sermon, and um, he said, "Yeah, the first time I got up, I prepared, and the pastor at the time told him, you just get up and go until you're done, and if there's still time left, he said, I'll scotch you." And I said, "Tommy, I have no idea what that means." And he's like, he said, "If you run out of stuff to say, don't worry, I'll jump up and behind you." I said, "Okay, great." And so he said he started preaching, and he said, "I'm out of soap" about 5 minutes in. And the guy said, I love all these old sayings, by the way, right? And so the other pastor got up and started preaching. Well, so Tommy told me, he said, "I'll scotch you. If you run out of soap, you're good, right?" So I got up, and Luke, this should amuse you, I think, that it's not a secret to most people that have had an opportunity to sit under my teaching or leadership. I did not run out of soap. I talked for quite a while, actually. Yeah, I went on and on and on. And so, yeah, I could have landed the plane probably a couple times, but Tommy was super gracious, uh, and said, yeah, that. So long story, even longer. There was a Sunday evening service. We had those as well, and Tommy was preaching about being obedient to the Lord's calling on your life, and there was they did altar calls all the time. And so he opened up the altars. Anybody that wanted to pray. And so I went down and prayed. And Tommy said, "Are you going to do what the Lord's called you to do, Charlie?" I said, I am. I am. And he's like, "Well, what is that?" I go, I sense he's calling me to ministry. He goes, "Yeah, I've known that for about a year." I'm like, "Well, where are you, Tommy? Where were you on that one?"
You could have scotched me on that one. Come on.
That's right. I was on a soap for a year, dude. But anyway, so yeah, he gave me opportunity to speak, and prepare me for pulpit ministry, which I'll forever be grateful for. And then from there, I would have opportunity after leading kids church for some time, at the same time volunteering leading junior high ministry, and then that evolved into senior high ministry, which evolved into overseeing junior and senior high ministry. And then but then eventually went on staff with Youth for Christ. That was my first full-time ministry position. I was part-time student ministry at the church, and my first full-time ministry was at Youth for Christ, and did that for a couple years, and then went. Man, I'm trying to piece all this together. It's been so long, and then and so then went to a different chapter of Youth for Christ, and while there, went on a work and witness trip, we called it, out to West Virginia. We were going to do
good old West
Virginia. Yeah, man, country roads take me home, baby. But we went out there to do a VBS, is what the plan was going to be. And the week before we went, they encountered massive flooding, and so we went out there, and essentially it was us, the Red Cross, and the National Guard, and help dig people out, like dig people's basements out. And anyway,
emergency work.
Yeah, that's right. So we did that for a week. And one of the churches that went on that trip in conjunction with Youth for Christ was a little bitty church in a town called System Park, Grace Bible Church. And I got to know those students that were there serving, and really connect with those guys well. And their junior high leader was on the trip and said to me, "Hey, our student ministries person, he's leaving, and would you be interested in having a conversation about that?" And so I did. And so I went down there, had a conversation with the church. They wanted to hire me to do part-time student ministry there. And I said, "Great." It was so perfect, Luke. The Youth for Christ office I was in, we were, it's missionary support. You have to raise your own support. And the office was in a real financial crunch. My salary was being cut at the time by 50%. And and I had my first daughter, Madison, had just been born. So here I am. I'm married a couple years, got a newborn daughter, and my salary's being cut. I'm like, what are we going to do? I get offered this position that was almost exactly what my salary had been cut. I'm like, this is the answer, right? So I go back and tell you the board, "Hey, I've got this offer." And they're like, "We don't want you to take that job because we hired you to do a full-time job." And I said, "Well, that's going to be difficult with the pay." They're like, "It's not going to last forever. We really want to encourage you to stay on doing the full-time work." I'm like, "Well, I can't do the full-time work." So I was in this real bind of what to do here.
Yeah.
And
it's hard to do full-time work on part-time pay.
It is. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And so So the pastor pulls me aside from Grace Bible and says, "Hey, I know that things are going well with the interview process here for the student ministry position. Uh, I am leaving the church to go active as a military chaplain." He was an Army Ranger, 10th Mountain Division, awesome guy,
Wow.
and September 11th had just happened,
Mm.
and so he just re-enlisted to go back with the 10th Mountain Division Army Rangers as a chaplain, and was going to announce that he was leaving. He said, "Would you be interested in taking that position as an interim? You could be the student ministries pastor and interim pastor and be a full-time job." And I
Mm.
said, "Yes, yes, I will be interested in that." And so I took that role, and yeah, that was my first role in senior leadership even in an interim capacity. It became very evident to me that we there were two churches under one roof. It was the old worship wars, very
Hmm.
contemporary. There was half the church. It was very mission minded, outreach oriented. We want to reach our community. There were some that were more cloistered, and we walked through about a year and a half process just to figure out who God was calling Grace Bible Church to be, what were going to be our ministry distinctives, those types of things. As we sorted that out, we had some folks who left well. Nobody left
Hmm.
angry. I'm really happy as I look on that. It really brings me some joy that it was probably best. There was another church in town that fit their ministry perspective much better. And so anyway,
Mm.
long story short, I ended up taking on the pastorate there. We served as a senior pastor there for 5 years, a little over 5 years, and it was really a gracious church to let me learn on the job. Right,
Mm.
wasn't exactly young, but I wasn't exactly seasoned either,
Yeah.
and so they were really gracious. That was
Well,
my first ministry position.
yeah. A little bit of trial by fire. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it
it's
is,
really true.
there's that common stereotype of like, there's youth pastors and then there's like pastors, like real
Yeah,
pastors that kind of
yeah,
joke. Like, Nick,
yeah,
who's my roommate, one of my
yeah,
good friends, he's been on the show. We kind of jive him because he's a youth ministry major. We kind
yeah,
of poke fun, like, okay, yeah, but one day you might be a real pastor. It's like,
yeah.
but
Right.
it
Yeah,
is real ministry though. Even if it's
yeah,
like the responsibilities are different, it shouldn't be looked at
yeah.
as like lesser ministry to be focusing in one group. And
Yeah.
it shouldn't just be seen as a stepping stone. Although I think that is good practice. Like I've heard that if you can keep the attention of kids church and junior high, then you'll be able to preach to
Yeah.
anybody. So,
No, it's true. Yeah,
mhm.
it's true. And it was really great ministry experience for me because we've always Angel and I have always viewed student ministry as uh a supplement to what families are already doing. Like we don't want to replace
Mhm.
we know in some instances there are students in the ministry involved that aren't that parents maybe aren't believers or
Mhm.
connected to a church, and so in that regard, we become kind of a surrogate, leader for them. But we always wanted to come alongside, so it was really great practice for us because we interacted a lot with adults and families. It wasn't just students because we saw it as like we want to do family ministry. We want to help equip parents to be able to lead their families, and
Absolutely.
yeah, that was really good. And it was hard because we didn't know what in the world we were talking about when it comes to parenting. Right? We had like a 3-year-old daughter at the time, and so
Let me tell
you
you how to
know
deal with your 14-year-old.
exactly, but I was, to some degree young and zealous and confident. And so there's some things that I probably said that were like, "Oh, here's what you should do." And now I look and go, "Yeah, that was probably good
Yeah.
advice. Yeah, not easy to do." Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
All right.
hmm,
So that's great. I always love hearing your story.
yeah.
But so like let's take that then from your first real full-time ministry position leading a
Mhm.
church to
Yep.
how we are now. How do we get from
Yeah,
there from Grace Bible Church to 1-7 Church?
yeah. So we were there a little bit over 5 years, and it probably about the 4.5 year mark there. Uh, we just started to really think about. I was having a lot of conversations with people back here in Kankakee County, Bradley Bourbonnais area that I had gone to high school with, or just have and built relationship with throughout the years.
Hmm.
And some of them said we were walking through really difficult situations with people, and so we just really began to have a heart for this area again. Sisseton is only about 45, 50 minutes from here, and so we were able to stay in touch with people and just really said, man, we have a real heart for that area. we began to pray and ask God, could we plant a church back in that area? And and so as we were praying about it, we moved back to the area, ready to plant a church and getting ready to gather a core group. And it was interesting at that time, and this is kind of the story of my life. And I haven't talked about this, too much as it regards my testimony. But it's been this thing in my life where oftentimes when we've made a decision to let's start this ministry or plant this church or something, then another opportunity will present itself that will seemingly be God honoring and maybe easier, a little less risky. And so there's always been that. It's been a pattern in my life. And so the first time that happened is when we decided we had moved back to Kankakee County. We wanted to plant a church. The church that Angel and I, Angel grew up in, and the one that I was attending after I came to faith in Christ, they had an opening for a associate pastor position, and they said, "Hey, you would be a natural fit. Would you come on board and do that? You'd lead community groups and discipleship." Oh, that'd be great. I really love that. Let's do that. And so we did that. We did that for about 2.5 years, and about 2.5 years in, maybe 2 years in, I went to the pastor and said, we just really came back to this area feeling like we should have planted a church, and we feel like we sat on our hands in that a little bit, and so we left there and began the process of going through assessment to plant a church and to figure out who and where we were going to plant a church. Long story short, we ended up planting a campus of an existing church. We planted Cornerstone Mantino, and we were there for 5 years. And then while we were there, we said, we really want to plant a church that's going to be missional. It's going to be kind of the scattered approach to ministry, not just inviting the church to us, but to say, how can we equip the saints and release them into every nook and cranny in our community? And so that's kind of been our goal with 1-7. We've planted that. Man, the years have all run together. I feel like it's 4 years ago now. We've been here and loving it, and it's not come without it's not come without its hurdles or struggles. But man, that is the Reader's Digest version of how we've ended up here. But we just really had a heart at the beginning to move back here to say, I just personally know a lot of people who are either unchurched or de-churched, who maybe grew up in a church, had some nominal connection to a church, and we just want to really create an environment for those folks who don't have a church background to be able to come in to, just like myself, examine the claims of Christ and to find the truth, to hear the gospel and have and so we're excited about the way that God has positioned us. It's interesting with all of the college students that we have and all the young people we have. It reminds me very much of, like, I feel like I'm pastoring a church of that kid that gave his life to Christ in at KCC's parking lot, when he came back being an architecture student, coming back going, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I just see this opportunity to help shape and redirect maybe people's lives who are coming through 1-7 and may or may not stay in the area, to redirect them for kingdom purpose, And I tell students all the time when they graduate to say, don't find a career, find a calling, find a way to leverage that thing that God has gifted you to do for the gospel. So God has given us so many, people that I can relate to, young Charlie. So anyway, that's how we ended up here, Luke.
Yeah. It's like, in some senses, you're being the pastor that you needed at that time.
Yeah. And I feel like I just want to be like Tommy too, who was so generous with, opening up his pulpit to young preachers and young men that wanted to go on and plant churches or go pastor somewhere. I want to be that guy, and I want to be a sounding board for the struggles. And again, I'm not so naive to think that the ministry landscape hasn't changed over the last 20 years. It certainly has. But I know that there's some things that are just timeless that young men are going to have to navigate. And I've made enough mistakes for all of us. And so I can hopefully point people through some of those things and say, hey, here's some of the things you may not learn in Bible college that, and it's not their fault. It's just, who could see that coming? There's no way to equip you for everything, and just share some of the things that I've had and that I've endured, and some of the things that just how it affects family. And so, yeah, I feel really privileged to have had to be able to sit underneath Tommy for the years that I did, and how generous he was with his time. And I just hope to do the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember 2 years ago was the first time that I came, around this time 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The first Sunday that I came to 1-7, I was looking for a church where I could really feel at home with the doctrine and discipleship practices of the church. And 1-7 was definitely the place that I knew that I belonged from the first Sunday that I was there. But I remember that first Sunday was the first Sunday going through the book of Luke. And we just wrapped up our series through Luke last weekend.
Oh man, were you there for the first week of Luke?
The first week, yeah.
That's funny. So you're the bookend there. We know how long. Yeah. So it's been 2 years. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A little over 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember when I got there first, we were meeting in the basement of a United Methodist church. And the church had just gone through some transitions, like a merger. So if you could say a word about kind of navigating those changes and trying to unite two churches into one.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. We started when we started 1-7 Church, we started with just a core group of people meeting in a dance studio. And we call those the bag chair days because we didn't have any seats. Everybody just brought their bag chair.
Mm-hmm.
We just dreamed together what it looked like to be a church on mission that lived out. The reason we call our church 1-7, and I know you know this, Luke, but for those who are listening, we just believe that the church is better 7 days a week than just one, and we don't want to diminish the importance of the Sunday morning gathering. We think that that's vital to the lifeblood of a church, but we want to exponentially raise the importance of Monday through Saturday as the church is scattered and lives on mission. And so we just got together and dreamed about that, and then we moved into, like, when we found out we were going to we kind of outgrew the dance studio that we were in, and they were kind of saying, hey, it's been great, but it might be time for you guys to find another home.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were looking for another place, and right down the street was this old United Methodist church, and they're a small congregation of literally under 20 people. And they needed some lifeblood. They thought it was good to have a young church gather in there. It was encouraging to them. I think it was financially beneficial for them. But they gave us the space, and we had ebbed and flowed in that space. We had grown at one point to about 90 adults and plus kids. And here's the thing that's it's hard when we planted, just because we had a church was made up of primarily, and I mean this in probably the most pure sense that I can, a congregation of formerly pagan people who had no real, really no church background whatsoever, and so like for someone, we would celebrate if somebody began to come to church once a month, because we're like, man, that's so much. It's more. So, it's 12 times a year more than you did last year. So
the step up,
yeah. So let's see if we can get you to twice a month now, right? And so, and then there was another church in town, Redeeming Grace Chapel, and their pastor, interestingly enough, was a military guy who is going active as a military chaplain. Like I've heard this story before somewhere, right? and so they were a smaller congregation, and they approached us. Now this time, we are probably about a year old, right? And we are just starting to kind of figure out who we are, and trying to figure out our DNA and who we have here and how God is assembling this church. And so we started having these conversations that if Pastor Andy from Redeeming Grace Chapel, if he were to go active as a chaplain, what would it look like for our churches to merge? And so we began about a 9 or 10 month process of having conversations with the leadership, pastors, or the lead teams, and just talking about what does it look like, and where do you guys fall on this, and what's your position on this, and to see what thing we held in closed fists and what things we were a little more open to having conversation about. And as we walked through that, we ended up in February 2 years ago voting to merge the two churches. And so we took on Redeeming Grace Chapel. They are now 1-7 Church, and it has been a journey. And man, this has been the most difficult season of ministry in my life. I think just navigating that and some of the unforeseen effects of that, and some all in all, fantastic. ride for us. But just thinking through like some of the things that we saw that were unintended, that like, man, we didn't see that coming.
Mhm.
And just now trying to figure out, who are we still? I think, we're 4 years in, and we kind of feel like we're just now where we were, as far as having our feet under us to be able to serve our community like we did 2 years ago.
Mhm. Yeah, there's always conflict and stuff that comes with change, new people coming together, and
Yeah, yeah, and thanks be to God, we never had any real, like, there was never any conflict, at least in the sense of like this group against this group. We've always
yeah.
had God's been gracious to us that we've always had unity, not not at the sake of, or not at the cost of doctrinal belief or ministry philosophy. God has been really gracious to us that we've had unity without uniformity, so to
Mhm.
speak. That we've been able. It's been really great, and the friction that we have had have just been, this getting to know one another, and of the merging of the two. I feel like, as we came in, it was just, it was two different churches coming
Mhm.
together, and there were some people that I think we lost to that, and not out of anger or anything like that, just kind of drifted, and
Yeah.
so it's been a learning process for me. I don't think there is no book out there that says here's what it looks like to be a year-old church plant to merge with another church. There's no, and so we figured it out as we went.
Yeah. So you kind of answered the other question that I had in mind, which was why the name 1-7 Church?
Yeah,
Because I
yeah,
remember on that weekend trip, I remember we went up, you, me, and Kevin and Nick, just a couple of guys that you've been kind of mentoring and pulling up in ministry. We took a trip over winter break to Grand Rapids to visit some bookshops and see the town a little bit. And I remember being in the basement of the bookstore of Reformation Heritage Books, and the librarian came down and he's like, "So what church are you guys from?" And it's like, "Oh, it's called 1-7 Church." And he just kind of gave me a blank stare, like, I don't know what that's supposed to
yeah,
mean.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I looked at you, and you gave me a look like, "It's you. You explain it."
yeah. See ya. I'm gonna go look at some books.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's interesting because, for the first, I mean, I'm gonna first long season in the bag chair days, we had no name.
Mm,
Like we were just kind of gathering. We were the church at the dance studio, and we didn't really have a name at all. Just because it really didn't. We weren't gonna. It wasn't like a marketing thing where like, we got to be driven by this name, right? And so, and
yeah.
and uh, and just off the cuff, one of the guys that was on the lead team at the time gave me a call and said, "Hey," he was the guy who said all along, "I don't care about the name at all. You guys figure out the name. It doesn't matter to me at all." He
Mm.
calls me up and says, "I got a name," and I go, "What do you mean?" And he's like, "I know that I said it doesn't matter." He's like, all this talk that we're talking about, how that we really want to make sure that the church is on mission 7 days a week. What about 1-7, that we live on our faith one day at a time, 7 days a week, and there's no one day greater than the other. And so I liked it, fell in love with the idea behind it. And as we started sharing it with people, one of two things happens. You people get inquisitive and go, well, what does that mean? And you go, oh,
Mm.
here's what it means. We believe that our faith in Jesus should have an effect on the way that we live our lives every day. And so that can start a gospel conversation with people that may be asking, or they think you're in a cult. Either way you go, either way you go, you have an interesting
Interesting
conversation.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
And I definitely
Uh,
love that. And I do definitely think that's one of the things that our church is good at, is realizing that gathering together for worship on the Lord's Day and fellowshipping with one another, it's a great and beautiful thing. It's important. But
mhm,
it's not to say that the rest of the week is unimportant. So
mhm.
I definitely love
Yeah.
that. So
Well said. Yeah. Yep.
so basically, just in closing, you're kind of stuck in quarantine. What are a few things that you're
Yeah.
doing to keep busy, like just with personal stuff? A good book you're
Yeah.
reading, a good podcast you've been listening to, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I'm currently reading in preparation for the Acts series. We're starting to, like Luke, you mentioned, we went 2 years through the Gospel of Luke, and now we're going to spend who knows how long. I'm going to assume a year and a half through the Book of Acts. And so I've been reading a book that I picked up again. I lent it to a friend a couple of years ago and never got it back. So
Yeah.
when we went on that book trip to Grand Rapids, I bought Stott's book on the Book of Acts, the Spirit, the Church, and the World.
Mhm.
And so I've been reading through that and preparing for Acts. That's been really, really great. Been doing that. have been reading just a couple books I'm looking at on my desk here. I'm reading a book called A Cruel and Shocking Act, The Secret History of the Kennedy Assassination.
Wow.
And so I love history. And so I'm reading through that. I'm reading through a book on the American Revolution era, becoming fascinated to read about Samuel Adams. And so just picking up some of that stuff. I've been trying to put together, Luke, we're going to put together a couple different podcasts. One's going to be a little more serious. One's going to be a little more fun. One's going to be called A Day in the Life of the Barclays. And it's just going to be a summary of what happens in our house every day, which most people don't believe is true. And so we've been working on that, trying to figure out that technology and how to do it efficiently without having it absorb too much of my time. And then lastly, I've started making my own beard oil and balm. And so
that is amazing.
Yeah. So that's it, man. That's what I've been doing on quarantine. Excellent. And it's been going a little stir crazy. And we've talked about that a little bit, but it's hard. And I just know that got to keep myself busy and intellectually agile. And so just try to read as much as I can. Yeah.
No Tiger King? Not yet?
Well, truth be told, I watched it all. Yeah,
oh my goodness.
I did watch it. Yeah. I'm ashamed a little bit to admit that. Yeah. I got sucked in and I don't even know what to say to that, Luke, except wow. I don't even know, man. Yeah.
That sounds like I'm just thinking that sounds like with the relationship that you and Caleb, one of our other elders, have, it sounds like something that he would call you up and being like, Charlie, you have to watch this.
Yeah. Okay. So what may or may not be true is that conversation may or may not have happened, but it may have gone the other direction. I may have called him up and said, I can't believe what I'm seeing. I go, it's like, I'm like, you don't want to see this, but you can't stop looking at it.
Wow.
Yeah. So true.
All right.
Awesome. Well, on that note.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you so much for Thank you so much for the conversation. I think this has been a blast. We're going to stop this recording and then go do another couple minutes on how we as Christians interact in this crazy time in coronavirus and quarantine. So if you're listening now, this will probably come out today on Thursday, probably around noonish. Next week, we're going to release that next episode that we're about to record. And so if we want to join us for more interesting conversations and strange anecdotes with Pastor Charlie, talking about how we as Christians minister and evangelize and love one another in the midst of this craziness. So with that, thank you so much, Charlie, for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Luke.
Yeah. As always, love God, love his church, and love your neighbors yourself. We'll see you next week.